Excellent. Okay, so good morning, everybody. This is Melanie Arth again for our Tuesday webinar series for NCI Works in Illinois. This is the third webinar that we're presenting just to drill down on some of the topics within the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And I wanted to open today by saying we're actually going to kind of reach beyond this piece of legislation and the regulation. I mean, I firmly believe, and Pam and I were talking about this recently, I firmly believe that the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act creates the board and provides federal funding for workforce innovation and opportunity activities. But essentially, when I read the legislation, the regulation, it's telling a board in a workforce area what you can do with the money that is federally funded, but it's not saying really, it's not limiting what you can do. So whatever the board needs to do to ensure a vibrant economy with a great workforce development system, you should find a way to do, whether or not you can use federal funds to pay for it. So I just wanted to start by saying, well, WIOA has been the context for these webinars, that there's an opportunity to have a bigger vision than what you see allowable or mandated within the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And so I'm going to kind of stretch, especially around funding, stretch that dialogue to say, you might want to do a lot of other things, and you're going to need maybe other funds to do those other things. So I get this here. So we're going to kind of put context around the conversation by describing what the board's fiscal rules are as established within the legislation regulation, and show where, they say even, collection of resources and kind of leveraging outside of the bounds is one of the roles that would allow you to do these additional activities. We're going to take a look at income and really talk about the board's role related to income. So you have, formula federal funds, you get some other kinds of opportunities for grants, but we're going to take a look at a bigger picture around what the board can do to make sure it has the funding it needs to do whatever it needs to do for the workforce system in the area. Then drilling down really specific to the board's role, primarily related to the Title I-B programs, the Adult Dislocated Worker and Youth programs, which the board has a very specific fiscal role for. So we'll talk about some of the requirements and some of the options listed in the, excuse me. And then really a significant amount of the funding, especially with a very specific Illinois state policy, is dedicated to training. So we'll look at what the legislation and the regulations say about your training options. And again, it's just an opportunity to step back and say, we have a system that's up and running. It's been doing certain things kind of over time that may become rote, and to step back and say, what are the other opportunities available to us, and to step back and reconsider if any of those are timely now, or just to put them back at the forefront of our mind and make sure we're staying wide open to all the opportunities and not closing down on any. All right, let me get this back off. So here's a slide that just pulled out from the regulation and the legislation, a very specific list of board roles. And I only pulled on the bullet, either listed under the section that describes the local boards or found throughout the document that are related to your fiscal responsibilities. So I'm just going to go over some of these bullets here, and then we will have kind of a bigger conversation about where to go. So this is the one that really opens up the opportunities for the board to be more than, all right, I'm going to go turn the phone off. Okay, sorry. I just want to turn off I muted the microphone so everybody knows they're on the master mute. So this is the really open-ended role under the board's duties that I think gives you opportunities to be more than what the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act requires. So it says here are the roles that are covered by this piece of legislation, but again, you can go above and beyond. So convening, brokering, leveraging systems, stakeholders, and non-federal expertise and resources. So this is really setting the board in the community of economic and workforce development and giving it specific requirements related to this piece of legislation, but I think also allowing and accepting that the board can go beyond kind of what these mandates are, and certainly can go beyond the federal funding formula. Within the regional planning process that has been completed for the first program year requirement, my sense is that folks that did local and regional requirements at the same time, which several states did, it was kind of a very concentrated, fast-paced event. But one of the requirements for the regional planning, and if we didn't have time to do it for this round, the next round, or maybe an edit after we're required to do 2-year reviews, is to really look for cooperative service agreements, regional service strategies that might make our investment go farther in terms of sharing the cost, administrative cost arrangements. I know boards in smaller areas in other states that share a fiscal agent or share a lawyer or pool their money to buy their insurances, and it brings the cost of insurance down because they're buying a bigger package, so it's more cost effective for them. So as you go forward and you're looking for ways to really especially take your administrative funds, which have a cap on them, make them go farther, you have opportunities to really use the regionalism embedded in this legislation to do that, including coordination for supportive services. So my guess is, and we'll have Pam, I'm going to have Pam jump in here. My guess is that the planning process, and you may be doing some of this already, knowing how kind of innovative and advanced you guys are, but my guess is that the regional planning process for most areas around the state that did it, you didn't have to establish regions until this year. Many states went straight forward with identifying regions and requiring regional plans. I just think the process was so consolidated that we might not have had a thorough opportunity to really look at this. Is that true, Pam? How did your regional planning process go in relation to these particular? If you could share your cam, that would be great.
Okay, there we go. Actually, you're absolutely right. The process this year was pretty well condensed. By the time we got our instructions and things went, we started planning. There really wasn't a lot of time to do much more than what was absolutely required. And in fact,
right.
We were kind of working on some of that. I do know that some of those kinds of things, regional service strategies, have been talked about as something that we'll work on in the first year, maybe 2 years.
Right.
And I also know that in the past, this was a couple years ago, when we were kind of between chief financial officers, we actually had a contract with one of our neighboring workforce areas, and she would come up and
right.
do some of the fiscal work for us, help out our other fiscal person. So we're not unfamiliar with those type of arrangements. Right. We just quite honestly haven't had any opportunity or really any need to do that since then.
Right. Right. So that's kind of how I was talking about it. I think it's forward-looking. I think a lot of the funding discussion we're going to have this morning is really about forward-looking. And certainly, I think when the new requirements that are in the WIOA, so there's going to be a new requirement for evaluation, for example, and that will trigger, I think, next year. So when you have to do a third-party evaluation, that might be, you're doing something new, you're building a new contract for a review. When it's new, it might be just started as a regional approach. And then again, once you pull your money, for things like insurance, once you pull your money, you tend to get some cost savings there. So I just wanted to it's a way for people to be thinking as they go forward, depending on their role and the committee that they're on. It's really, for me, I think I would recommend a standard operating procedure is, how do we extend every dollar we spend? And this is another version of keeping it in the front of your mind to think about it as an opportunity. All right, so let's move on. I'm going to turn the cans off. Stop sharing. Back to the board rules related to workforce development funds, drilling down specifically to a main responsibility of the board is the development of the board and Title I program budgets. And new this year, related to the budget, was the initial part of starting the negotiation with the chief local elected officials and required partners on infrastructure funding and other cost sharing. And I'll have, when we get to a more detailed slide about that piece of work, I'll have Pam give us kind of an update on where your area landed. New in WIOA is a very specific responsibility assigned to the board to conduct oversight with chief elected officials on the use and management of funds in order to maximize performance. So this role, use and management funds to maximize performance, is going to be asking, did we do all these things? How effective were we, not only just at spending our money on what we were supposed to spend our money on, but more importantly, I think, is how effective were we in using these additional strategies as sort of a standard operating. So fundraising, leveraging funds, cost sharing, is kind of how I recommend all board members and board staff to think about the way they manage their money. And I make this statement, and I've made it for probably 10 or 15 years as I've been doing this work with local boards. I've almost convinced myself, and maybe many others, is that there's enough training dollars in a local community for anybody who wants to get training to find the money to help them pay for that. And I think that includes our federal funds, but I think it includes employers who have an employee benefit that will help pay for training or tuition reimbursement. I think there's all kinds of grants and subsidized loan programs. So, to the extent that that's true, then part of, I would think, the board's role is to make sure that anybody who wants to get training gets training, whether or not they're eligible for an adult dislocated worker or youth dollar. So for me, when someone comes in the door and says, I want to go to school, we say, great, every American should be, growing their skills. Let's see if you're eligible for our scholarship, and if not, let's find other ways to make sure you can go to school. So that this is like the practical application of thinking this way, is that it's not yes or no, you're eligible for our program. It's if you want to go to school and we can't spend our money on you, what else can we do to make sure that we're marshaling all of these resources and getting anybody who needs skill training in order to get ahead. And then we'll talk a little bit at one of the slides toward the end about some of your contracting obligations as one of the structural ways that you are in charge of management of funds. Okay, so am I missing any of the, in your mind, Pam, any of the specific roles related to finances? I think we got them, right?
Yeah, nothing I could think of, nothing additional.
Okay. So let's talk about income, and I'm just going to put this on a list. This is not necessarily where you are getting money from, but these are all of the possible sources of income related not only to workforce development, but income that could actually come to the local board for whatever you have as a vision and strategy for your local area. So certainly, I think formula funds are kind of the basis for our operations. They drive our understanding about what we're doing, and in some cases, I think they might limit what we do in the way I was just describing, that we have this money to spend on eligible people to get training, and that's sort of our full scope. But once you start kind of going beyond that scope, you look at other areas or other methods and strategies for increasing your funds. So grants are definitely opportunity. There's ongoing federal and state opportunities. Much of the money withheld at the federal level and state level is expended in grants, and these are grants to do a number of different things. Over the past 10 years, these grants have been government's way of doing R&D. So they want to try sector strategies. So they put out huge regional, what were those called, grants, so for people to work together to create sector strategies. Right now, for example, there's a huge push on apprenticeship. So there was just released a series of grants to give to regional areas in order to expand the apprenticeship programs in their area or build new ones. So I think grants, even the federal and state ones that come with a lot of very specific strings attached. There's also philanthropic grants, business and business organization grants, and there's a lot of opportunity to increase the income coming into the workforce board by keeping your eye out on the grants. And we'll talk about some other tips on how to do that. New this year, well, I shouldn't say that. The workforce, the WIA always intended for partners to share the cost of not only the infrastructure but the one-stop system costs. We weren't effective in that, and you can't actually be effective at the local level trying to get partners to share costs because many of your partners are run by state agencies. So WIOA for the first time really took that to a much greater level of requirement and specification, and I think when we get to a slide that has this detail on it, I'll have Pam talk about it. But the good news is that the emphasis on making this a real attribute and a real requirement is that it not only will it bring money into the board for costs like rent and facilities, and to pay for the board and conferences for the board, and to pay for technology and websites, for example. It also reduces the amount of money that the Title I-B programs have to pay, because for many areas across the country, most of these costs that were not shared were picked up and paid for by one or two partners, and in many cases by either by the Title I-B programs alone. So there's two pieces of good news related to funds on infrastructure and system costs, and actually sharing those with partners. Fundraising is an opportunity. This is, generating in-kind third-party contributions, having events, doing issue-related drives, like the United Way does, or a blood drive. I mean, really figuring out how you get your issues clear, and if you don't have the money you need or you're not allowed to spend the money you want, really driving for the funds for that. Leverage funds, the regional agreements, we just talked about it, but there's a way to leverage funds in your contracts. Certainly work-based training is a very significant way to leverage funds, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then fee-for-service, which has always marginally been allowed, but they actually wrote it into the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and they specifically wrote it in around business services. So prior to WIOA, WIA was fairly restrictive on what you could actually spend money on related to business services, and there's a lot of testing of the line. There was a lot more done than really was specified as allowable, but now they really have a really comprehensive list of allowable activities that boards can use their Title I-B funds on. And they specifically call out a list of services that aren't paid for by other government programs, meaning nothing is paying for this service to be delivered for you to do fee-for-service. So we'll have a little bit of a conversation on that as well. All right, I am just going to keep turning you back on, Pam, in case you want to add anything. So we're going to talk about each of these income sources, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, and then just kind of draw down on them. Where are we on them, and what else might we want to do about them, or make sure we have a better understanding about what they are in terms of the source of income. So I think we're going to stop for a minute here and just do a little bit more of a discussion around the Title I-B formula fund. So as everybody probably knows, or if you're new to the board, you might not know, the federal funds that are allocated to pay for your adult and dislocated worker and youth program. They come out of federal government into states under very specific formulas, and then the formulas can be, especially for dislocated worker, adjusted or modified within state, and then the state allocates the money to the local areas. The good news about WIOA is that they wrote in funding levels into the legislation, and they're increasing the funding levels for each program year, although it still continues to be determined through the annual appropriation process. But under WIA, it really says such sums as were deemed necessary. It really just said, you know, whatever you think is necessary. WIOA really has a very specific level, which I see as a target, and it gives, I think, Congress a target to go against when they're talking about the funding. So if they reduce it, they'll know by what amount required by law they are reducing it. And I think it will just change the dynamics of that conversation when it's not such sums as necessary. There's a transfer authority within, and this was tested, and there was waivers granted on WIA, but now it's written through legislation that a local board with the governor's approval can move funds from the dislocated worker program into the adult program, or funds from the adult program into the dislocated worker program. And in a minute, I'll have Pam give us an update on that. There's sections where the regulations say additional requirements, and they're getting really clear, especially when the requirements maybe weren't necessarily clearly called out in WIA, that funds shall be used to contribute to costs of the one-stop delivery system and to pay for employment and training activities. And then occasionally at year-end, your area might get what I call sort of overflow or unspent funds, reallocation among local areas. If some areas aren't spending all their money, that money is recouped and redistributed. Unspent set-aside money, unspent rapid response funds. So occasionally, kind of at the end of a year, there might be an influx of funds, but it tends to have kind of a quick deadline on it. Might cause a flurry of activity. Okay, so let me just have, I'm going to go to the next screen. Oops, that's not what we wanted. Where did I have this? Okay, sorry. I am looking for my formula funds. Okay, so Pam, why don't you just spend a little bit of time, especially for purposes of the recording here, just let me turn the mute off and let's put our cams back on. Just kind of telling us about, especially the transfer authority, where you landed on in your local plan, about you know, whether or not your board will be taking advantage of the transfer authority, and then just for purposes of people who don't really understand the limitations or the constraints on those funds, give a little bit of a rationale about why that's happening.
Okay. What we've done, well, first of all, this year, our formula funds altogether, the three major funding sources, were cut just under $450,000. So, you know, that sounds like a lot of money. It certainly is a lot of money. But thankfully, we have some carry forward money from our previous year that will help offset that loss. So for the coming year, the year that just started July 1st, we should be right around the same funding level that we were last year and the year before. So that did give us the opportunity to at least start kind of at level zero. We weren't really starting with a loss. In terms of planning.
Good to hear.
And so what we are able to do now is, because of the fact that WIOA places such emphasis on work-based learning, and because we are certainly subscribing to that strategy, we hope to actually serve even more individuals, put more individuals into those types of activities, which really, in the long run, cost less than if we sent someone to a 2 or 3 year training program. So in terms of what we'll be doing, we'll certainly be placing a lot of individuals, like I say, into work-based learning activities, not just youth, but also adults and dislocated workers. what we've done in the past also, I know we talked about like the transfer. Last year, we transferred about $260,000 from our dislocated worker program to our adult program. And we did that because the need of our local adults was greater than the need by the dislocated workers. There was, even with that transfer, we certainly served all of the dislocated workers that were coming into our office. But we also wanted to make sure we were able to have enough funding to put the adults through through training that were coming in as well.
Can you just repeat the number, like, and what percentage of your, was it 20% of dislocated worker funds? What was the dollar amount, and was it? I'm just trying to get a sense.
Yeah,
where you were when.
It was probably about 20%.
Okay.
Yeah, it was $260,000, so it was probably right around the 20% that we transferred. We will certainly look as we're going through the year at the need, which is what we base everything on. We will take advantage of that transfer authority if the need is there, whether it's adults to dislocated workers or dislocated worker to adult funding. In the state of Illinois, even though the law allows 100% transfer, the state of Illinois is only allowing 50%. Now, you can actually request a waiver or an exception to that and transfer more, but for right now, the state has a limit of 50% on the transfer between adults and dislocated workers. So,
is the request period open-ended? At any point you can
Melanie, they are still working on a lot of their policies.
Okay. Okay.
That's something that we expect to see going forward. In fact, we just had a meeting last week and we're discussing the whole process, and they're actually going to have some help doing that. So there's not a lot of policy yet on how those things are going to be done. But and again, I think we just have to. I know internally we do monthly budget meetings with our management staff and Kathy Day, who's the executive director of our fiscal unit, and we go over where we are and where the needs are and things like that. So we definitely stay right on top of it, and if we need to transfer money, we will certainly implement that process.
Right. Well, and I think part of the reality is that many dislocated workers meet the definition of adult. So the adult funds they have broader scope in terms of who can get served under them. So even when you do transfers, you're not necessarily ever serving the dislocated worker population because you haven't essentially ruled them out. So I think I like that they gave you 100%. I'm curious. I wish I knew the rationale about Illinois, and maybe they just want to walk people into understanding the transfer authority, and maybe they'll increase it over time. But within no time flat, I have a lot of clients who just went with 100% transfer of the dislocated worker funds into the adult funds, with an ongoing, fairly fast-track flexibility to move back if they needed a target. But I think the other thing to keep in mind around the transfer authority is that when there's a significant event that creates dislocated workers, like a plant closing or a huge mass layoff, additional monies come out of the state, rapid response monies, and state set aside for dislocated worker comes into the area. So even when you're moving the money around, if you run into suddenly a specific problem, you're going to have access to additional funds. So even national funds, if they do emergency grants that renamed, I can't remember their names. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of put
that is true. And Illinois used to have a policy of somewhat limiting those rapid response funds, but last year they kind of opened it up. So if there is a need for dislocated worker funds, additional funding, we certainly have access to that, and also trade. Some of the dislocated workers actually fall under the Trade Act. so there's money available for trade events. So there's more opportunity for additional kinds of funding, in addition to just the formula funding for dislocated workers as well.
Right.
So that's why I say we really, those we need to serve, we certainly do.
Right. Well, and I think just the main point here is these are the dislocated workers, a specific targeted population, and the adult funds cover a much broader section of your targeted population. So moving money into the adult funds mean more lower income people, more basic skills deficient people, more of those facing barriers to employment under the general list of barriers to employment get served. So I like the flexibility. I like where you're going. I hope your state comes up with some really kind of easy to use fast track processes to move the money back and forth. Okay, so let us move to the next slide. So I'm going to go. I'm going to go to talking about each of these specific kinds of income sources. We just talked about the Formula One funds. They do tend to be the baseline. This collection of money tends to be the most significant amount of money under the board's purview, and tends to really drive a lot of the activity, the policy discussion and the spending discussion. But I want the board to think about your formula funds kind of as your trust fund baby money. I mean, you get it under formula, it comes to you every year, and you have to do really specific things with it for the most part, and you might be able to do a few additional other things with it. But it's the trust fund money that comes every year, and it's fixed and formatted in terms of what you can do with it. So when we want to get beyond that, we go to all of these other things. So grants, I think, are something to maybe heighten our awareness of, heighten our focused attention on, really track not just the federal and state opportunities, which tend to come to us when there's federal grants and state grants available. We tend to be on the distribution list, but how to really be more broad in scope around being alerted to or aware of grant opportunities that are out there. I think that's one strategy. I think the second strategy is to really consider how to contract for a grant writer, maybe share a grant writer at a regional level, figure out how to, the way a grant writer gets paid is by winning grants. I know I've been paid as a grant writer from other areas where they wrote in to the grant administrative funds, including funds accrued for the production of the grant, especially some of those TAA, CCT, did I get enough A's in their grants, are very significant processes. So really considering as in the not too distant future, if there's a kind of a really a fluid schedule of grant opportunities coming out and you don't have the capacity now to give the attention that you need to write a fabulous grant and win the grant, that you really consider grant writer and maybe share that cost again. Maybe it's even an IWP thing that the state could consider and really kind of marshal them out. You want to mimic the themes in the grants, so I think more and more that grants, especially the federal and state grants that are coming out, are expecting a regional response as opposed to a local response. The feds are really promoting regionalism, that they're expecting that you write any type of grant that you write connected to a sector strategy or career pathways, that you really loop it in to some of the themes or work-based training, you loop it into integration. So even if it's this, for example, the recent released opportunity for grants to expand the apprenticeship program, you want to apply to that grant probably on a regional basis. You want to apply to that grant by tying pre-apprenticeship programs and apprenticeship programs into your manufacturing sector strategy and into your logistics sector strategy. And even now there's apprenticeship programs in healthcare. So maybe you apply for expanding apprenticeship programs in the region to support your healthcare sector strategy. So I think keeping in mind how to win a grant by mimicking all of the themes in this legislation gets you more points from the readers. Making sure, this is the other thing, not just regionalism, but making sure there's multi-applicants on the grant. So government, education, and business are combined as the grant requestees, and you have a business organization and an educational organization and a government organization such as the board really co-requesting this grant. And then including fund leveraging. So we're asking for money to expand the apprenticeship program, and we're also going to use some of our own money that we're using in our sector strategy to further the apprenticeship program. So always imply or document leveraging, even if it's not required in the grant. And those are kind of just my best suggestions for grant writing. I'm going to let Pam just give us a brief overview. This doesn't go into effect until next year. It was fairly complicated, so the feds created an extension allowing us to use our WIA strategies for moving forward. But local areas had already made progress in establishing, in Illinois, they actually had a template with 2 Excel spreadsheets where they were itemizing what was meant by infrastructure and system costs. And I think the good news is beyond the infrastructure costs, which are facilities and rent and technology, there was a clear understanding that there's other costs for operating a one-stop system. And I'm in Illinois, I keep calling this sheet 2. So it's really to pay for the cost of the board, to pay for the cost of shared staff in a resource room, for example, to pay for the cost of shared service delivery, different activities. So I think, again, the good news is this is going to reduce the dependency on the Title 1B dollars, and it will be a source of income for the boards or the one-stop operator that the board selects through the competitive process, because this is where the money goes. And they're being very clear at both the federal and state level that this is really cash or in-kind services with a very specific value attached, and the in-kind service contribution has to be something that was on the budget. So you can't give computers to the system and think that wipes out your $10,000 partner share if buying new computers weren't in the budget. So just briefly, Pam, can you give us a quick update on how you did locally, especially in terms of identifying additional costs that will be shared by partners and not have to be paid solely by 1B?
Actually, I wasn't as involved in the cost sharing part. Again,
okay.
Kathy was, and I'm wondering if maybe she would like to speak to that, if she needs to be unmuted or whatever, if she would like to speak to that.
Yeah. Actually, and Kathy, if you can click on your webcam, that'd be great. I see you have, I think you've set it up.
Yeah.
Briefly.
I am here, but I don't know if anybody can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Sorry about the interference if you hear some things, but I am in the car today. What we did is we took it to heart that we should have a neutral convener and did hire out someone to come in to take over the negotiation process for us this year. We felt that this year was very important that it be totally a partner activity. And with that being said, the state did provide very good spreadsheets. Everyone listed their costs for the system, which was the first. We had quite a bit of conversation of the facility costs. There was also extra space where we are our comprehensive one-stop center, and so the state agency was willing to take away the idle capacity so that people were paying for empty space that they have. With that being said, the partners did come to an agreement that this year they would be looking at trying to help with the system cost as much as possible.
Excellent.
Those that are in the facility would contribute to the facility cost as much as possible, with knowing that the following year, in 2017, when we renegotiate, relook at all the costs, then at that point, everybody would be responsible for both the system and the facility costs. So I think the state spreadsheets were very
let me just, assuming, Kathy, you'll be significantly attached next year, and then certainly the One-Stop Operations Committee, I think that's what you call it, right, Pam? Who has direct attachment to this. So I think the other thing that I love, I worked with Kathy Lively in Southern Illinois as her outside facilitator in the process, and while the delay for a year kind of took the wind out of our sails, we ended up with the same kind of agreement. The other thing that they committed to as a workforce development community is really exploring the additional costs that they now understand to be system costs, and they want to add, especially to what I've been calling page 2, that system cost budget. So for example, I would include the one-stop operator and the cost for the one-stop operator on that second sheet, and as I recall, there wasn't a direct line item for it. But the one-stop operator, in my mind, it's like the mall manager, and everybody in the mall helps pay for mall management. So that was one of the options that I recommended. This might be where your grant writer goes. You might want to share staff across the one-stop community of partners for a grant writer who brings money in that helps for services to, multiple populations. It's certainly also where you could do shared staff functions. And one of the things that I loved about it, and the reason I'm giving this example is because there's a lot of talk about braided funding. The problem is WIOA specifically says braided funding is not allowed, that nothing in that piece of legislation creates allowance for it. In my mind, it's how you leverage and cost share, and I use that term as a proxy for braided funding. But your resource room staff are essentially staff who need to be able to deliver services for multiple program partners. And there's a way to fund staff from multiple sources of income if you use the cost-sharing budget to do that. So once you establish a proportional share, part of that, especially in the systems budget, because staffing's not allowed and in-kind staffing's not allowed in the infrastructure budget, can be used to, for example, in Southern Illinois, they agreed that there needed to be 2 sort of well-trained navigators in their resource room who could provide the partner requirements for career services unique to their program on site and make the really good connections to partners. And they're going to share the funding for those 2 staff. So it's an example of this other kind of payment plan that I wanted to give an example of, because braided funding is something you're going to have to work really hard at. I'm assuming it's going to be a state-level strategy, and I'm assuming the state-level agencies will work with the feds to really create more allowances for that type. But at the local level, you can do these leveraging and cost-sharing agreements that mean multiple sources of funds are paying for specific needs in the system. All right, so anything in addition anybody wanted to add to that? Some of the partners that were on this phone want to talk about this new cost sharing? All right, so I'm going to move on to fundraising. We have 2, 3 more specific sources of income to really talk about and explore. I have a couple of examples. I like setting goals for fundraising, specifically based on your priorities. So once you understand the requirements on how money gets spent in terms of the WIOA federal funds that you get, and the musts and the mays and the limits on what you can spend, you are sure to have items on your list that you really want to make sure you can do and make happen and implement. And that's how you set a fundraising goal. I had one board, I think I at least mentioned this, Pam, maybe offline and not during any of our webinars. I had a board in New Mexico. They were a serious collection of Energizer bunnies, but they had in their bylaws that the board's annual fundraising goal was equal to, at a minimum, any amount of formula funds that they were reduced for any program annually. So you didn't have your overall federal funds reduced, Pam, because you had carry in to offset it. But if in any year you take a $500,000 hit, you know, it has to be significant. It's a lot of money. It means less people getting the training they need. And in this instance, in this New Mexico board, their minimum fundraising goal was $500,000. So their plan was to stay revenue neutral. And they were very motivated by it. It was surprising. It was one of the roles, the board roles, that created kind of the most investment and energy for board members. And when you think about it, other types of boards and other types of boards that they might be on, fundraising is a pretty common requirement for board members. So setting a goal and being very specific about it, priorities, new ADA equipment. We really, I know each local area, while in lieu of the state figuring out how you share data, needs a shared database system. Maybe that's one of the goals you want to do fundraising around. Facilities improvements that are sort of beyond the scope of your admin funds. Focusing on youth, out-of-school youth, youth transferring out of the foster care system. Really setting a priority based on kind of an issue or population-related, setting a goal. I think fundraising might be something that gets specifically, if it's not already, again, this might be true for you, gets specifically added to a committee or maybe multiple committees or to staff, that, you know, keeping your eye on opportunities to do fundraising, generating in-kind third-party contributions. I had a client in New York whose entire resource room was full of computers that were surplus from a call center in the area. So every year they got essentially brand new computers from a company in the area. And they also got an in-kind contribution of staff IT time, so that they had their corporate staff come in and make sure the equipment was running, the internet was working. So and all they requested, and this was so fabulous, and the way I found out about it is there was a little sign on each of the computers in the resource room that said this computer and its support were provided by, and the name of the company was in there. So it's really getting in the brainstorming mode about how you can go above and beyond kind of just focusing on your Title I formula funds, and really whatever you want and you need, having a wish list. That's the other thing I always tell people. You've got to have a wish list that's beyond your federal funds, and then start using that wish list to guide these other fundraising opportunities. Okay, a couple more to talk about, a couple more examples. Leverage funds, we already talked about the regional agreements. There is specific language, especially in the final regulations, that talk about, and I'm going to unmute people so that Pam can hear me, that talk about when you are contracting for the mandatory contracts for youth service, or the contracts for the one-stop operator, or the contracts for career services if the one-stop operator doesn't do it. So anytime you're writing a contract for service that you can use as a weighted option inside that contracting, the responder's capacity to leverage other funds. You can make it a part of your point system to say, not only what do you bring in terms of expertise and service delivery, but what do you bring in terms of leveraging funds and having additional funds that you're willing to share in this role with this community or population that you're serving. So that's just another way to really, every time we spend money, to think about how we make that money go farther. Work-based training is not only, as Pam pointed out earlier, it's not only a likely method of getting more participants into training, because it essentially costs the board less per participant to do a work-based training option compared to an individual training account, which tend to be 2 or 3 times what the total cost of work-based training is. Not only is it likely to increase your number of participants, it's also a form of training where you share the cost with the employer. So the board has a share that they pay to offset the employer's cost of training, and that comes as a wage subsidy. So if you know on-the-job training, we pay the employer to do training to an individual for specific limited list of skills that they're missing in order to be qualified for a job. And for that cost of training, we offset the the wage subsidy, and the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act allows that to be up to 75%. So you might get more employers interested because the amount's higher, but you also might be able to use that 75% for sector strategy OJTs and really incentivize employers. But in either case, if you're paying 75, the employer's at least paying 25. So it's a way to leverage funds. And we talked a little bit about braided funding. Another very significant way to leverage funds, a practical way in the One-Stop Center, is co-enrollment strategies. So how often a veteran can be co-enrolled in the dislocated worker program and in the trade program, for example. How often a dislocated worker is also an adult. How often a youth is also, an out-of-school youth is also adult. And it allows you to use funds from multiple program sources in order to ensure success of that individual. So it's not just a way to count or manage performance, it's also a way to leverage funds. Okay, I'm gonna switch to fee for service. Let me just stop and ask if anybody on the phone has any questions on any of those methods or any comments. How are we doing?
Melanie, I would just say that we do have, our board did approve the on-the-job training reimbursement for up to the 75%. The additional 75% is really earned based on different criteria. So it really is an incentive to individuals, and we are actually employing that strategy right now.
Perfect. Excellent. Yeah, I like that you went there, and I like that. I like what you said earlier about your board's really getting on board with supporting work-based training as really a major resource in your toolbox, because it does so many positive things. It's just like win-win-win on so many levels. All right, so let me just talk briefly about fee for service, and I have a couple slides that give you the opportunity to understand where this might be, but I want to introduce it and see if anybody has any questions or comments, and if we can just raise a little bit of a discussion about this funding strategy. So fee for service has always been allowed, but it's been very complicated. It's essentially been limited as an option to local providers as opposed to state partner providers, because one of the questions about fees is, where does the money go if you're collecting a fee? You have to be essentially a 501c or have a vet capacity to create one. WIOA lets all boards become 501cs. I know Best Inc. is a 501c, correct, PMS? I said that right? The board isn't, but yeah. Best Inc. is?
Correct.
Okay.
So
they specifically call out fee for services under a section near career services in the regulation, where they list 3 groups of employer services that may be provided, meaning they are now explicitly allowing the board to use its Title I-B funds to provide services to employers. And this has been a very gray, sticky area in the past, with boards doing very minimal staffing and minimal, just enough to kind of keep the job orders flowing into a system, and then wishing they could do more, or maybe doing a little bit like helping write job orders, or really doing a little bit more for current workers, kind of HR functions. So now they have created a list of employer services, and again, it's 3 groups. And the main reason there's 3 groups, it kind of tiers or mirrors what's going on for individuals, is if the Wagner-Pizer funds, so your state employment service, federal agency funds, those funds pay for a very specific list of employer services. And because they do, you cannot charge a fee for that. So under the regulation, there's a list of, I think it's called basic employer services, and that's really the labor market information, the labor exchange, kind of posting a job to an electronic job board. It's really a very limited list of services. It's a short list, but they are saying that these services are already paid for by government funds, so you can't create a fee. And then they create a Group B services called customized services, and then they create a Group C, additional allowable employer activities. And in the B and C, each of these, and I'm just going to point it right out to, in each case, I'm quoting regulation and the legislation here. So once you're customizing, tailoring, or really getting in depth into human resource services for employers, you may charge a fee. So I'm going to leave you beyond this webinar to look at the list of services. I'll give you a couple examples, but I just want to tell you this was probably half a dozen years ago now. Anyway, when I worked in a county similar to yours in terms of scope and demographics, geography, in Oregon and the southern part of the state on the northern California border. Beautiful space. But they have been doing employer fees when I got to work with them for a number of years already. And at the point at which I was working with them, their fee-based employer services were so far advanced and so highly valued, that they were generating enough income to hire 4 full-time staff to work on their business services. So they were revenue generating and pouring the revenue right back into delivering more services to more employers because they were raising a fee. So let me just have people on this phone. Let me give you a couple ideas. So customized screening, customized employment-related services, customized targeted job fairs, any of the human resource consultation, writing job descriptions, helping them learn how to interview better, analyzing employee turnover, helping them comply with, writing policy to comply with wage and hour or safety and health regulations. And then all of the sort of macro level business services, not employer by employer, are listed on this allowable list. Implementing sector strategies may be provided on a fee basis. Customized assistance, customizing pathways, skill upgrading, assistance to employers in managing a reduction in workforce, marketing. So there's this huge list of services that you can now, you may spend your funds on and you may charge fees. So I just wanted to stop for a minute and ask people what they think about it. And I know, Pam, your board has at least one service experience with a fee. So I want to see, do we support this strategy? Do we think fees for services is, at least worth exploring further from what you're already doing?
I'm going to let a couple other members talk first, and if there's no conversation, then I'll just kind of jump in.
What do other people think? Carrie, I think you work with employers. Rhonda, Sarah, Diana, Al, Lisa, Sally. Anybody have some thoughts on this actual strategy?
This is Al. Hey, well, yeah, as we talk to employers or our business services team, the folks that work for Tori Davis, the subject of charging them something has never come up. Now, there's things here beyond what we normally do, but setting up hiring events and stuff for them, there's never fees charged for that sort of stuff. Some of the things that are mentioned here are certainly more in depth, and I suppose you could charge a fee, although we won't be doing that, I wouldn't think. We'd be an IDES. So then who would that fall under? Title 1B folks setting up the fees?
Or it might be the board creating, business employer team, which all partners participate on, and for some services there's a fee, right? There's a lot of different methods of doing it. I think what we really need to think about is weighing in what you just said, Al. If we're already doing it for free, would we ever add a fee, or are we talking about new services that we don't do that are more in depth? So that's one conversation you would want to have. What else? What are other people thinking about? Someone else started.
This is Lisa from Tri-County Economic Development Alliance. And we have an issue, in that we're so spread out in our rural areas, and I would suggest that we have a lack of talent for some of these applications for our businesses. And so what we need are resources to actually look at what we can provide, because we lack them in our northern part of the region.
Got it. Well, so two things. One is this list may be delivered using Title I-B and assuming the other partner funds, and comma, it may be something that generates fees for you. So it sounds like, given the geographical challenge and the funding shortage challenge based on that geography, it might be something worth a feasibility study on, at least. Feasibility study. How about other folks? Rhonda, Sally, Sarah, Carrie, Diana. Anybody else have any thoughts on fee-for-service strategy?
This is Pam, and I was just go ahead. Whoever that was, go ahead.
No, Pam, it was Melanie. I was going to move on, but I was just going to ask you to talk about your current experience, because you are using it for the program.
Right. We're using it actually for fee-for-service for the essential skills training. So, and that works well. I can't say that it's often, but on occasion, we do provide the essential skills training on site of the business. A couple other things we are actually reimbursed for. We're parts of grants, one with Goodwill and one with the adult or the justice system, the probation, and those were reimbursed for our time for providing job search assistance workshops. So we get funding in that way. But I kind of agree with Al. I think some of these things that we've been doing would be kind of tough now to start charging for. But if there are some new services, perhaps some of the things that Lisa alluded to, those might be the things to look into. And then if we do decide that this is something we'd like to pursue, maybe those are the kinds of things that we could actually charge a fee for, and then bring back to the system and put those towards some of the things you talked about, Melanie, whether it's improvements in the one-stop centers or targeting certain participant groups, maybe youth or something like that. Scholarships would be wonderful, internships.
Right.
You know, I mean, we could do different kinds of things like that. Certainly something to look into as we go forward this first year especially.
Right. Well, so let me just summarize up. One thing I think your board needs to have is a wish list. So what kinds of things would we invest in order to improve, expand, enhance, and maximize workforce development in our area that we can't do based on existing funding levels or based on existing funding requirements and limitations. So at least start doing some of this. You know, maybe each committee develops sort of a wish list based on, you know, what they're struggling with that relates to regulation. I think the second thing is really to do kind of a feasibility study, and there's two ways to do that. It's sort of, what is the need? So this area in Oregon, if I can track down, it's been a long time since I've been there, but if I can track down some contact information, I'll send it to you, Pam, just to explore what other areas are doing. So what they discovered was that all of their small employers, their bulk of small employers, were underserved because they didn't have enough staff, A. B, they were struggling with basic human resource department requirements because they didn't have a human resource department, so that they found the owner or the owner's husband was spending a lot of time trying to create regulatory policy that was required and not having success doing it. So they really discovered that there was this void and these major issues shared by most small employers. So they started to see themselves as kind of the human resource department for large numbers of small employers. So that was their segue into it. And again, they used the revenue that they're generating off these fees to put back in so that even more small employers get served because they're growing the staffing of that department. And I will tell you, fee-for-service will let you know right away whether or not you have high-quality service, because if it's not high quality, they're not going to pay for it, right? It's this whole other relationship to understanding what is needed is only what you offer, because nobody's going to pay for it if they don't need it. And are you doing a good job, because they're not going to pay for it if you're not. So it's this whole other dynamic, and I'm hoping you really do spend some time kind of studying the need. That's one half of a feasibility, and then applying it to your area to see if this is something you want to go forward with. Okay, we are officially over time. I'm going to spend a few more minutes kind of at least going through the remainder of the slide, especially because we have a recording being produced, and I talked to Pam yesterday, I thought this might be a comprehensive way for new board members just to listen to this webinar to get an understanding about this whole part of their job. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to present the slides. I will shorten them up a little bit. I want to get the whole presentation recorded. So if you're on the call and you understood that this is targeted a little bit more for 60 minutes and you can't stay, I totally understand. But I'm going to go ahead and continue the presentation. So I am just going to review a little bit of the detail. Now we're going to drill down really to the main source of funding for local boards is their federal funds. And they come in under the Title I-B programs. And by Title I-B, I mean the adult program, the dislocated worker program, and the youth program. And these funds come in with a lot of requirements. So there's a whole list of musts and a shorter list of mays. But if it's not on the must or the may, then you're stretching about whether or not you spend your dollar on it. So let's go through the must. So here's what the budget starts with in terms of requirements. And the Workforce Investment Act, WIOA, created a lot more minimums and musts in terms of investments than WIA did. So let's just review them quickly. Illinois, and I think this, I've said this before to groups in Illinois, the state created a policy that said the local funds that are distributed for these three programs, at least 40% of that allocation must be spent on training services. And I don't think that was never an intent for any local board. I just think that under the old funding formula under WIA, that Title I-B funds were disproportionately being used to pay for the system, so the facilities costs and the board's costs, so that the amount of money they were not paying on training and or program services continue to grow. I think this 40% allocation will get a lot easier to meet now that there's mandatory partner sharing that will kick in next year. In addition to the state policy, the feds have a 10% cap on administrative costs, and 90% must be spent on allowable program and other service and activity costs. And I think they do a pretty good job, and people generally understand between what is an administrative cost and what is a program cost. And that is unchanged, but it's just another piece of a string that is tied to this money. The Title I-B cost sharing budget is part of your new allocation. So once Kathy Day's work this year is going to get you some income. Next year there will be a very specific amount assigned to the Title I-B programs as a share, and that will go into your budget, and it will be your share of the board costs and outreach costs and career services and service integration and facilities costs and technology and equipment supplies, as opposed to 100% being paid for by your programs. At 75% of local funds, this is on top of the 40% allocation for training, 75% of local youth funds have to be spent on out-of-school youth. I think we talked about that already. Pam, I think you told me you're already above that margin. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Work experience, so within the youth of the funds, so they're basically saying out-of-school youth in a work experience is the combined priority. 20%, not less than 20%, shall be used to provide paid and unpaid work experiences that have as a component academic and occupational education. So you have to figure out how you take the total youth dollar amount, assign 75% to out-of-school youth, and 20% of the total, including what you may already be spending on out-of-school youth for this service. And then there starts to be a must be used to, without these margins or measures, shall be used to develop, convene, or implement sector partnerships. I'm glad they called it out specifically prior to this under WIA. I know folks got in trouble for spending money on any kind of business services, and certainly doing research and development on sector partnerships got a couple boards in trouble, especially because they were using formula funds as opposed to targeted grants, and to establish relationships and networks with large and small employers and their intermediaries. So when you're starting your budget, you kind of feed into it all of these first layer requirements, and you start taking your dollar amounts and apportioning these percentages out to start to understand its impact. To several more of these on slide 11, on-the-job reimbursement rate increases up to 75%. So that can be significant. I think most boards, I'm not sure about you, Pam, but I think most boards were doing all of their on-the-job training at 50%, which was the WIA maximum, up to 75% now. I just want to make a plug for a strategic way of thinking this. For example, let's say 75%, it has some list of requirements and factors to be considered, and your board has created some. But up to 75% does not mean you automatically go to 75% for all on-the-job training contracts. So there's a strategic way to say, in addition to these characteristics that we look, maybe we say 75% OJTs are limited to businesses in one of our 3 primary target sectors. Excuse me, or 75% reimbursement is limited to the top 10 in-demand occupations that are the hardest to fill in our region. So to not just go there and assume it's the natural, but really to give it some additional strategic investment consideration. Local board can reserve not more than 20% to pay your share for incumbent worker training, and incumbent worker training is now available as a local training option. It used to be limited to kind of a coordination with the state, but not more than 20% can be reserved. Not more than 10% for transitional jobs. This is essentially a new training component included in WIOA, although it has been used for different populations in the past. But this is really paying a wage for someone on a short-term job to get them some employment experience and history. Up to 10% for pay for performance contracting, which is starting to be a new way that, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on an upcoming slide, where WIOA for the first time really allows essentially training funds were essentially given to an individual or given to an employer. So you either got an ITA or an OJT directly to an individual, and that was a training fund, or you did incumbent worker or customized training, and that money was given to an employer or a group of employers. They are now creating a new way to provide training funds directly to training providers. And the ways they're talking about doing this is, for example, pay for performance contracting. Over the next year, you can use up to 10% of your funds to create one of these. Although the final regulations that were just thrown at us last week, does say that a feasibility study has to be done before you go into pay for performance contracting, but they are allowing you a percentage of your funds. And then we start to get to the, less the must or the mays or less the max and the mins, and we get to start to look at this list of may also be. And I've given you an example on one that I'm sort of passionate about. Funds may be used for work support activities for low-wage workers, including non-traditional work hours, on-site child care, while such activities are being provided. And the reason I called out this may and I have it here is because I care deeply for low-wage workers, because I think these are people who are trying to get ahead. They have jobs. There's many two-income families, both the mom and the dad are working, and they're barely getting to the poverty line, but neither of them can reduce their work to go to school because, again, they're working so hard at minimum entry-level wage jobs that they're barely getting above the poverty line. Well, now you get an opportunity to not spend all your time with unemployed workers, but actually to really start working with people who have jobs. And there's this great target for you to work with low-wage workers and maybe find ways to get them ahead. So the other reason I like this is because our performance, the wages might go up. The retention certainly would be good if they increase their wages. So there's all kinds of dynamics invested in this. Most of your funds, 40%, must be spent on training services. So I just duplicated, especially for board members, the detail of what the list of training services are. And you may be doing all of these already, but for example, entrepreneurial training is specifically called out on the list. So while you're doing occupational training, on-the-job training, combat worker training, and entrepreneurial training is on the list. So just really expanding our idea of what we can invest that money in. And this list is just to give you a snapshot of repeating what was in the legislation. And then I'm not going to go through the detail on slides 13 and 14, but it also, now we're really deep into the other things that you can spend your Title I money on. So expenditures may include, that's what this list says. So it may include customer support services for navigating people with barriers, especially those with disabilities, technical assistance, research and development characteristics are in here, staff training, employment and training activities in coordination with child support services, enforcement services, cooperative extension programs, activities to facilitate remote access. So you may use your funds to do more video conferencing and setting up kind of kiosk versions of your one-stop entree systems out in remote areas. I think, Lisa, you were talking about that as an employer challenge, but it would also be obviously an individual channel. Collaboration for the board, sort of economic development activities, promoting entrepreneurial skills training, micro-enterprise services. So now we've really gotten this whole allowance may be spent, and they're clearly calling it out on more activities and services that are really directly related to economic development. And again, this is essentially was a marginal activity under WIA, but now they're actually saying you can spend your funds on these studies, calculating a self-sufficient standard for the local area, implementing promising services, kind of non-traditional training programs, for example, for homemakers and non-traditional occupations. So this is the list of may be spent on, but again, I'm giving you the context under which you spend your Title IB funds, which is a significant amount of money in your budget, but I'm hoping you're seeing whatever you need to do beyond that also gets on a list, and the board figures out if we need different funds to do it, how to make that happen. A couple of reviews on your contracting. Some of these requirements are new, but again, within a contract, you have capacity to really think about what kind of investment you want and whether or not you're going to require leveraging in the contracting language, whether or not you're going to require in-kind contributions. So really, how do you use your contracting to marshal the best deal for that which you are purchasing? You have to competitively procure the one-stop operator by 2017. Look at that number is totally wrong. Everybody looking at that 2107. There's definitely a typo here. Can I just check with you, Pam? Was Best Inc. is the operator? Is that correct? You're the one-stop operator, correct?
Well, right now there's a consortium where Think and your Employment Security and Tri-County Opportunity Council.
Okay. So this year, your local plan and regional plan required you to be kind of doing feasibility and R&D studies to figure out how you're going to actually competitively bid for that, and that will happen in 2017.
And again, we're waiting on state direction and state policy for the procurement of the one-stop operator.
Right, and I'm assuming, as is typical, certainly in Illinois and in most states, that it'll say here's the state requirements, and there'll be a bullet that says and others that the local board can add. So if they're not requiring leveraging or in-kind contributions or kind of things that help you feel like you're using this contracting opportunity to also leverage additional resources, then you could add that at the local level. You have to identify eligible providers of career services if that's not included in your one-stop operator, or you may want to contract for both of these separately, even though certain providers will respond to both and want to do both. You've already been doing competitive contracting for youth services. Again, look at the contract and see what can we put back into our RFPs for youth services that turn our $1 into $2 or $3. And these are the two methods. I'm just going to deal with them indirectly because I think you're going to definitely be waiting for a lot more state guidance and or policy on these. But for the first time, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act allows the local boards to use their training investments to contract with training providers. So up until this point, you've essentially been able to use your money to give to individuals to purchase their training, or to, an ITA or an OJT, or to give to employers, incumbent worker, customized training, to train, a group of workers. And now they're creating two direct contracting with higher ed opportunity and a training contract opportunity. And they're giving a lot of requirements under which you consider it. But it's something at least to start considering, because anytime you group or bulk a collection of services, you might get a cost per. So if I'm sending 20 people a year to a training program at a community college, and there is no other training program available for whatever that occupational training is, I could probably contract directly with that school to buy the 20 slots for a lower than a per ITA cost that you are spending now. And that's the main reason I put it on this page. And it's the only point I want to make, is that once you start bundling and buying groups of training slots using your funds, that you're in a different position for negotiating the cost. You don't have to pay the value of an ITA for an individual when you're buying, when you're contracting for training. You're in a new area there. And the training contracts that they're allowing have to be this pay per performance contract. So here's when you can write a training contract, at least the federal requirements that have to be met, customer choice. You really do have to determine there's insufficient providers of this training, which allows you to contract. It's the most appropriate way to award the fund. It doesn't limit coverage choice. And if you do training contracts, you have to make sure it's a pay-for-performance contract. And I just included enough information for people to understand this whole new strategy. You can use 10%, you may reserve 10% of your funds to do pay-for-performance contracts, but there is in the final regulation a requirement for a feasibility study to be done first. So this is going to be available at some point, but it's a good new way to think about a new relationship with a third source on your expenditure list, which is training providers directly. And I think pay-for-performance contracts are going to get you a better return on your investment than perhaps we have now. Certainly, you could write into a pay-for-performance contract if the individual got a job related to the training that you're investing in, paying for your investment in, and have a lot more control over those outcomes than we sometimes do now. Okay, I think that's the full amount of content for me. I'm hoping people got a broader thinking about your role as your fiscal roles as a board and as board members. Got some ideas about also the requirements, the musts and mays. And I'm going to open all of the mics and see if anybody would like to have some questions, thoughts, clarification. Specifically, love to hear from folks on the call: Carrie, Diana, Kathy, Rhonda, Lisa. Any comments, considerations? Was this helpful? Was this content helpful? Let's start there. Could I get folks to respond? Was this content helpful?
Oh, I know you gave me a lot to think about, Melanie. Damn. I don't know if it's helpful.
Can the PowerPoint be available?
Absolutely. The PowerPoint needs two corrections. I made one correction this morning, and we'll fix that 2017. But I know Joanne sends it out in advance and then resends it and then posts it. And also, this recording will be available once we figure out how to get this amount of data that a recording takes up. Once we figure out how to get it posted, it's challenging.
Melanie, I have a question for you. This is Carrie.
Hi, Carrie.
On page 11 of the slides, you talked about that work support activities for low-wage workers.
Yeah.
And you talked about the on-site child care. I understand that low-wage workers would probably be eligible for the adult program, but on that on-site childcare, does that mean that we could actually set up a provider to do that, or would it be like through supportive services and just reimbursing for on-site childcare?
Actually, it's probably both. I mean, the way I see this happening, so it's a bunch of interesting dynamics. And again, I love your question because I'm very passionate about this group. These people are already working, so they're talking about what it might cost you for non-traditional hours. So let's say you have a security guard cost, right? These people can only come to school at these hours if they bring their kids. So you might contract with an on-site, with a licensed child care provider to come and provide those child care services in a space in your center that meets the licensing requirements, and you provide all of the trainees with the supportive services ticket that says this is paid for, however you pay for them now. Or it might be an off-site provider for whom creates 10 spaces every Tuesday night, for whom you pay the cost of the child care provision because this is a low-wage worker being covered in one of your programs. So they've really thought carefully about, and the two such as and may include, they've really thought about the dynamics and starting up or expanding if you already have one of these sort of low-wage workers. Yeah, but you can pay for child care services now as a support service. They're saying you could do it on site. I mean, assuming licensing and all those issues aren't too complicated, but that would be ideal.
They're talking about on-site being like our centers, not like an on-site at a low-wage job. Like, let's say we had
Right.
individuals that worked at a low-wage job, and the only way that they could get child care is to have something on site. We couldn't help set up a site place at an employer.
Right. Right. They're talking about while low-wage workers are in activities that you are providing for them to get ahead.
Okay.
You can't. Yeah. Well, an on-site might be at the training provider. This might be figuring out how to create an on-site childcare program at your community college, and you get to help leverage your funds to pay for it as long as they're targeting low-wage workers into the classes. I mean, I just feel like there's a ton of opportunity here to really build something that could benefit more than low-wage workers. And everybody knows child care is a key issue for working with the SNAP and the TANF folks. It's a key issue for definitely low-wage and low-income workers. I mean, it's why I pulled it out. It's on the list of May, but I pulled it out and I put it on this page because I thought, wow, this has so many opportunities for floating a larger boat that I always call it out, and I always try to have this kind of distinct conversation about it. I'm glad you asked the question. How about other folks? Useful information, questions, clarifications? Pam, any final thoughts? No, I'm glad you got.
No, I think so. I even said that I think you gave us a lot to think about coming up this next year. I was jotting down some notes, which we'll certainly take to staff and to the board and discuss, take to the partner committees and discuss those and all of our committees, because I think there's probably a little bit for everybody. So
Right.
I really like
Right.
that. I like the wish list idea too. So very good.
Yeah. Excellent.
Can
Okay.
I ask another question, Carrie, again, about that same topic?
Absolutely.
We're working with DHS and providing some like job search assistance and stuff because they're mandated to now make their individuals go through some type of program who are on TANF. We could potentially set up an on-site child care at our facility during those workshops, correct? And not enroll those individuals, but they're low-wage workers, or they are trying to...
Or both.
Yes.
Or both. Or
Yeah.
both. So you could use TANF funds. You could use Title I-B adult funds for low-wage workers. And whatever that employment activity is that the TANF folks are participating in, let's assume it would be beneficial low-wage workers. A fair number of low-wage workers are in retail, for example. and they have control over their own schedules. So they can work their 40 hours on weekends and in evenings and participate in daytime programs. But they're also implying with that a lot of low-wage workers work 9 to 5 and need non-traditional hours in order to participate. But it just opens the door. It really opens the door to creating a support service that's more significant and has a specific appropriation of your funds, and that's childcare. It's fabulous. I love it. I love this conversation too.
So do I.
All right. Okay. I love the webinars with you guys. They're always exciting and good discussion and good stuff. All right. I'm going to say good morning and stop the recording. And Joanne, you and I will figure out how to get these recordings posted.
Actually, I'm Joanne, so she will. I promise.
Excellent.
Okay.
No, I'm gonna connect with her and see if I can help. All right. Thanks, everybody.